It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At CareFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from CareFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Corera, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
In Walmart's Who Newville, joy started to grow. For online-only savings sure to steal the show. Tech treats and toys so dazzling and new. Walmart Cyber Monday deal soon ready for you. It's online only with very little time to spare. December 1st will soon be here, so be sure to be there. The Who's are prepared. Are you ready too? A day packed with savings. Amazing! Who knew? Subject to availability, terms and fees apply.
Get your mother-loving ears on because your big-time radio DJ's got news. PayPal lets you choose how you want to pay for all the stuff. With PayPal, I can pay in-store, pay online, or pay over time. What's that? You want this translated into song? I hope you're sitting down. You can pay your own way. You keep those ears on, you hear? Don't just pay, baby. PayPal.
Learn more at paypal.com.
Rulers who are sometimes quite absolutist and also quite insecure. You know, if you've got an insecure hold on power because you're the Tsars and you can see all these enemies, or you're the Bolsheviks in the early days who see, the White Russians, all these others trying to undermine them, then inevitably you turn to secret police and to use sometimes brutal methods to hold on to power. And then this persists even through to the modern day. And, Boris Yeltsin for a while thought, oh, should I get rid of the secret police? And he was like, actually, I think I need them against all the enemies. And Vladimir Putin, of course, is a former secret policeman himself. So this continuity is really strong there, I think, in Russian, Soviet, and then Russian history.
Hello. In March 1992, in Vilnius, Lithuania, an old man walked into the recently established British embassy holding a bag containing sausages. But those sausages were concealing documents liberated from the KGB archives in Moscow. And the old man was Vasili Mitrokhin, chief archivist of Russia's secret police. His defection provided the West with vast amounts of material that provided information on the Cambridge spy ring, but also ongoing operations, including the illegals, Soviet moles burrowed deep inside American society. Gordon Corera joins to discuss his new book, The Spy in the Archive. Gordon is speaking to me as part of the Chalk History Festival, which runs from the 23rd to the 29th of June. Aspects of History is sponsoring Gordon's talk with the novelist Charles Cumming. Links are in the show notes for Gordon's book and Chalk. Please do share with friends and family, and if you can give a kind review, I'd be most grateful. But in the meantime, sit back and listen to me talking with Gordon Corera on the spy who tried to kill the KGB. Gordon, huge pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you very much. Looking forward to talk to you about this.
Yes. So, the Mitrokhin archive has been a publication of fascination for me since I think I gave it to my father, the hardback book, when it first came out. It was about 99, 2000?
Exactly. 1999 was when the hardback came out. And the
yes.
First emerged of this story. Yeah.
Yes, extraordinary. And then reading your book, which I wanted to mention, I love your short little chapters. They are, hugely compelling and make it very enjoyable reading. But this is this starts off with a kind of this speaks to a question I've always had, actually, from a historical standpoint, about how what the significance is of espionage and whether it really is important or not. And I suppose the Mitrokhin archive is the answer to the question that yes, it is important. But this very nearly didn't happen. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's really a fascinating story about one man's obsession. You know, someone who's an archivist, you know, effectively a kind of librarian, but for the KGB, and who is obsessed with actually bringing down the institution he works for. And you're right, he goes to this extraordinary length of copying down the most secret files in the world, the secret history of the KGB. But actually, as he's doing it, he isn't a spy in the traditional sense, because he's not being doing that because he's been told by MI6 or the CIA to do it. He's doing it because he is obsessed with what's in those files and the darkness it shows and what he thinks it shows is being done to Russia. But he doesn't have a plan with what to do with it. And so the extraordinary bit of the story is, for years after he's effectively finished, he doesn't know what to do with it. And he then, as the Cold War finishes in 1992, he is walking into embassies in the newly opened Baltic republics, you know, formerly part of the Soviet Union, but now independent, and saying, I've got this. And at first, no one's listening. You know, and it's extraordinary, because the Americans at first just see a grubby old man, you know, who's around 70 years old, who looks and acts a bit like the kind of archivist he was, and is actually dressed down like a tramp, deliberately to not draw attention to himself. And they look at this man trailing a shopping bag with what he claims are secret files. And some of the Americans basically go, nah, this is not, you know, this guy's not for real. He's not for real. And so initially, even though he has what is effectively a treasure trove of secrets about the KGB and about the Soviet Union, you're right, it almost doesn't happen. And yet, you know, going to your question about the importance of espionage, those secrets are important not just in the kind of narrow sense of, you know, telling you about who's an agent and spying operations, but they gave a unique insight into how the Soviet Union functioned, and more than that, how it spied and influenced countries around the world. So it was actually a history not just of the Soviet Union, but of the way in which the Soviet Union's covert operations had reached into, you know, whether it's Britain or whether it's parts of Africa or parts of Asia or elsewhere around the world. So a kind of a real treasure trove had been collected by Vasili Mitrokhin, but it was nearly missed, and what to do with it became a really complicated question.
I guess also, you know, the archive really does show how, and perhaps you can expand on this, the KGB is intrinsically linked to the Soviet state. The two are, you can't have a Soviet state without the KGB.
Yeah. And I think that's where we tend to sometimes see the KGB as a parallel to MI6 or the CIA. And actually, it was something far different. It was, I mean, you know, Mitrokhin himself would actually see his enemy. He actually visualized it as a beast, as a creature with three heads, and those three heads were the Communist Party, the KGB, the secret police, and the nomenklatura, the kind of elite who ran the Soviet Union. But he saw them all as three heads of the same creature that he was fighting, and absolutely saw the kind of way in which the KGB was a force which held together the Soviet Union, which often tussled for power with the Communist Party itself, and yet was also driven by an ideology which actually outlasted the Soviet Union. I think that was one of the most interesting things that I came to through this book, was that Mitrokhin came to identify this force, and he would talk about it as Chekism. Now, the Cheka was the secret police founded by Felix Dzerzhinsky, by Lenin, you know, right after the revolution in 1917. And it was originally called the Cheka, and then it would eventually evolve through different names into the KGB. But what's so interesting is this idea of Chekism outlasted the Soviet Union. So today there is, people refer to Chekists' Day in Russia, and Vladimir Putin and people around him would consider themselves Chekists. So there is this sense in which it's much more than even just the KGB as the secret police. There is a kind of ideology of Chekism, which is much deeper and actually predated the KGB and outlasted the KGB and is still powerful in Russia today. And I think that is one of the power that's really at the heart of Mitrokhin's story. Is what he's saying is beware this force that exists and that has grown and of which the KGB is just really one part of its history.
So do you think then that there is something intrinsic in the sort of Russian character that means this is almost inevitable? Because, of course, we saw secret police under the Tsarist regime.
Yeah. So it's a good question. I don't think it's so much the Russian character as Russian history, which I think that the Russian, under Tsarism, you had the Okhrana, which were the secret police, and who were a pretty dedicated and ruthless bunch who learnt how to use agents provocateurs, who were aware of all the kind of anarchists and other revolutionary as well as Bolshevik threats to Tsarist rule, and so were particularly active at penetrating, their enemy groups and spying on them. And what's interesting is there's this continuity because, the people they spied on and penetrated and, used double agents again were the Bolsheviks who then come to power and then use those same methods in the Cheka and then the KGB to deal with their enemies. And then you see a continuity even after the KGB dies and the Soviet Union falls, where some of that same mentality is there in Vladimir Putin and those around him, the modern day Chekists. So there is a continuity through history, I think, which is not quite uniquely Russian in that sense, and which lasts and persists all the way through. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's the Russian character, but it's Russian history and if I think the way to think about it is rulers who are sometimes quite absolutist and also quite insecure. If you've got an insecure hold on power because you're the Tsars and you can see all these enemies, or you're the Bolsheviks in the early days who see, the White Russians, all these others trying to undermine them, then inevitably you turn to secret police and to use sometimes brutal methods to hold on to power. And then this persists even through to the modern day. And, Boris Yeltsin for a while thought, oh, should I get rid of the secret police? And he was like, actually, I think I need them against all the enemies. And Vladimir Putin, of course, is a former secret policeman himself. So this continuity is really strong there, I think, in Russian, Soviet, and then Russian history.
When Mitrokhin approaches the British embassy, and we're in 1992, so the Berlin Wall has fallen and the Soviet Union's broken up. Is this something then that, because he retired, I think, in 1985.
Yeah, 84, yeah.
84.
Yeah.
And so, he waits 8 years. Why does he wait that long? Should we question that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think it's fair to say he died many years ago. He's a psychologically complicated person and quite introverted. And so it's not easy to sometimes unpick his motives. He'd created this archive. He'd written up his notes of what he'd found in the KGB files. And he didn't know whether he'd ever be able to get them out. And there is this tradition in Russia of writing for the drawer, which means you're writing it, putting it in a drawer because you know it can't be published at that time, but you hope one day the situation might change. And this is something you see with Bulgakov and Solzhenitsyn and other Russian writers, who actually inspire, in some cases, Mitrokhin. And so he's written for the drawer, he's written his archive, but he doesn't know what's going to happen with it. And in the late 80s, after he's retired, he looks at ways of perhaps escaping from Russia with his archive, but it's quite big. It's not something he can carry easily over a border at that point without being stopped and without being arrested, it being seized and it being all over for him, potentially death. But certainly a pretty terrible fate. So he does sit on it. He sits on it for years until from 91, when the Soviet Union has collapsed effectively and kind of broken up into its constituent parts, the border controls are weakened. And then he sees his opportunity to cross the border, into the Baltics, knowing that that's somewhere he can get to where the border controls are weakened, but it's not the West. But there are Western embassies just starting up there who he can approach and say, I've got this literally bag of secrets, which you might be interested in.
But when he is interrogated, I suppose, or interviewed at the very least,
Yeah.
his motives are, well, there are kind of two motives, really, aren't there? There's his lack of success as an operational agent breeds a certain amount of resentment, but also, as you've mentioned, his distaste at what had happened. But do the two immediately make Spies nervous in that, he's got a motive which might mean he editorializes the archive?
It's a really good question. And I think if you speak to spies, which I do a lot, they will say this is always one of the key questions. When you meet a source or someone offering something, is understanding their motive, and not just the motive that they express to you, but the real motive underlying it. And it's often complicated. And I think Mitrokhin is a perfect example of how it can be complicated. Now, actually, in some cases with spies, it's quite simple because it's money. They want a payoff, or they want a visa, or they want to, or they've got into, trouble, in personal terms. They want to escape their marriage or something, so it can sometimes be actually quite simple, but often it's expressed in different ways as ideology, as, a distaste. Mitrokhin was, I think, very interesting because you're right. He starts his career as a part of the elite first chief directorate of the KGB. These are the KGB spies sent to spy abroad. The KGB also does domestic control on dissent, but border guards. But the elite are the first chief directorate, and he's part of that. And he is sent abroad, but his career ends effectively in failure because he doesn't prove to be a very good spy. Perhaps he's unlucky. He's not good at the office politics. All those reasons. And so what happens? He's relegated to the archive. He's sent to the archive. Partly because he loves files anyway. He'd been trained as an archivist in the Second World War and in that period in Moscow. But and then what he sees in the archives changes him and makes him increasingly ideological. So there is a complex overlay there between the grievance, having failed and being banished to the spy. So the desire to, if you like, inflict revenge on an organization, but also what turns into a genuine ideological hatred of that organization as he starts to read the files and sees how, this organization is suppressing dissidents, it's spying on its own people, it's manipulating people, it's encouraging denunciation, all these things. And so when he encounters MI6, that is one of the questions they have, because he certainly doesn't express the bit about personal frustration and grievance. He expresses the bit about ideology and wanting to hate the KGB. So I think it is that there is a bit of unpicking that which has to happen. And, I found it quite challenging researching him to follow that path because, he, in his writings and when he spoke to people, obviously would not want to reflect on his own failure. He wanted to focus on the ideological aspect. But I think they're definitely both there as part of it.
So you never met, because he died in 2004, I think.
Did, yeah. Yeah, I wish I had. I met lots of people who met him and knew him, many in different capacities, but no, I never did. No, I wish I had.
And what was it that sort of drew you to the story? I mean, it is a fascinating story, so there's that. But, why did you want to write about it?
It's a good question. I mean, I write about spy stories, and occasionally you come across ones which are intriguing and interesting and have both a character in Mitrokhin and consequence, and I think he really did have consequence. And on another level, the previous book I'd done was Russians Among Us, which was about kind of Russian deep cover spies in the West. And actually for that, I briefly dipped into the Mitrokhin archive because I'd been looking to see which is available in Cambridge and also as well as in book form, to see what he'd said about these deep cover spies. And I remember at the time when I was working on that book, so that would have been kind of 6-7 years ago, thinking, oh, this is quite interesting, and I think, like a lot of people, I had this vague recollection of Mitrokhin's book coming out in 1999, this big book, and bits about it, but I didn't really, hadn't really thought much about the man or why he'd done it or the consequence of it. So the seed was planted, and then the more I looked at it, the more I spoke to people, the more I thought, actually, what's so interesting here is you've got a very dramatic human story about a spy, about why he did it, about his escape. But you've also got something which tells you about Russia and about spies and about Putin and about where Russia is today and about whether we should have spotted the way Russia would turn out today. And I think all of that, can be told through this lens of Vasili Mitrokhin. That's what I think is so interesting, is it's not just a story of one man or one spy and his consequences, but it is a way of understanding the evolution of Russia particularly from Soviet Union and Cold War days through to what it is now under Putin.
Yeah, that's what makes this book so fascinating, because I think before I received it, I assumed, oh, okay, this will, be like a look back to I think he described the Cambridge spy ring as the Magnificent Five or something. And it would be that traditional story, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. But yes, it does speak to this sort of much more interesting, more contemporary form of Russian spying, the illegals that you write about in the book, who are these deep moles living in America, that are uncovered thanks to his archive. And as we know, Anna Chapman is probably the most famous
of those deep cover
yeah
spies.
Yeah.
So that was what I wrote about in my previous book. And Mitrokhin had exposed many of them, that how they'd worked in the Cold War. And these are extraordinary spies who are, because Russia, the phrase illegal is an interesting one, because you have your legal spies who are, if you like, legal because they're under diplomatic cover, and your illegals are posing as ordinary people. But often in Russian terms, an illegal actually takes on a different nationality. So the Russian will pretend to be a Canadian and then go live in London or something like that, or a Canadian and then go live in America. And they use these extensively. And Mitrokhin exposed many of these when he came out in 1992. But what's fascinating is Russia still uses them, and it kept some of those from the Cold War going, and it bred, a new generation of illegals who are still being found today around Europe, or, in recent months and years are being arrested. And it does show this kind of persistence of Russian intelligence operations and Russian intelligence culture, which I think is important, and it is different from ours. And I think, I think understanding that helps you understand Putin's Russia.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Did we in the West then, or the intelligence services in the West, did they think when he appeared in 1992 that they'd almost won the intelligence war and it was over? And that actually, wasn't the case at all.
Yeah, and I think that's what's interesting is that, I talked to a lot of people from this period in the early 90s. And what you had in both America and Britain was effectively a fairly small group of people who were like, hang on, we should still be worried about Russia. But around them, within MI6, within CIA, but more importantly, within the State Department in the US, within the Foreign Office in Britain, were people who were saying, Cold War is over. We don't really need to worry about this spy versus spy, this stuff, all this Le Carre, this is all kind of nonsense of the past. We can forget about it. Russia is our ally and our friend. We can be talking to them. Our spies can work together through what's called liaison. They can cooperate with each other to deal with counterterrorism. It's all going to be fine. And, there are business opportunities, economic opportunities. That's what we should be doing. And there were a small group of spies who were kind of like, hang on, there's still something to worry about here. There are still threats emanating from Russia, and Russian intelligence is still active. And they were, they still had spies inside the CIA and FBI who Russia continued to run well into the 90s after the end of the Cold War. So there was definitely a tension there, and they were seen as dinosaurs, those people. And even when Putin comes to power in 1999, a lot of people in MI6 think, well, maybe he's a good thing. He's someone who's competent, kind of keep control of things, and that was the mood. And I think that was one of the problems for Mitrokhin, is that here he was with all these secrets about the Cold War, and people were like, the Cold War's over, and his book comes out in 1999 and people are like, Cold War, this is, as you said, it's like Cambridge spies, very interesting to the public. We all still love our Cambridge spies in Britain and talking about them, but it's fundamentally a bit of history, and he was actually able to see and to say that there's something persistent about this, and there are still dangers emanating from what had been the KGB and from this Chekist mindset. And I think that is at the heart of the bigger story of the book, which is the warning that he was offering. He was offering this warning, which actually very few people were able to understand. And for that reason, I mean, it is, the CIA turn him down when he approaches their embassies in 1992, partly because from the top, the orders are, we're going to play nice with the Russians. MI6 do take him in and do work with him, but, it's not an easy relationship. And I think, most importantly, I don't think his warning is quite appreciated, particularly in the public, but even in government itself.
It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At KRFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from KRFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know KRFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at KRFM.org.
Do we know at all what the reaction was, certainly, with Putin when, I guess he knew of the defection beforehand, but at publication, is there, which coincides with Putin coming to power, is there any kind of, do we know his...
No, we don't. I mean, we don't have a direct... I mean, the Moscow, when the book came out in 1999, they were kind of like, this is nonsense, this is nonsense. They're clearly quite shocked by it and angered. And I think one of the interesting things, if you, is, as I said, Putin is a Chekist, and he would see himself as that, a kind of former KGB man, but who, it doesn't serve that communist ideology, but serves the kind of Chekist ideology, which is that we are a group of people whose job it is to protect the motherland, and you have to do what it takes to protect the motherland. That is essentially the kind of Chekist mindset, and that's why it can persist from, the Bolshevik days through onwards, and that makes them pretty hard people, but also people who hate traitors in their mind. And so it's one of the interesting themes. If you are a kind of Chekist, you have a particular hatred for people you perceive as traitors. And I think, we don't know about Putin's reaction to Mitrokhin, but we do know how much he hates traitors. And I mean, when I say hate, you should see the language, Putin uses. I mean, he is, it's the kind of talks to them as animals, as pigs who deserve to be killed, and if you want to understand, for instance, why Sergei Skripal gets poisoned in Salisbury with Novichok in 2018 by the Russians, the answer is partly because he is seen as that kind of, traitor to the Chekist cause, in his case, military intelligence. And that, so you do get a feel for how visceral, the kind of hatred is. But it goes back again to the sense in which spies, Chekists, this kind of cult of the spy is actually quite central to Russian, political culture, and more so even than it is to ours, where James Bond is a kind of bit of fun and Le Carré is a kind of curiosity about British history, but actually the kind of the spy and either the good spy in Russian terms or the evil traitor is much more central to Russia, I think, than it is to us in the UK or in the US, and has been through popular culture and right up to today.
Yes, I suppose, in this country, our spies don't tend to get to high office and become, prime minister. And indeed, we tend to knight our traitors, don't we? So
thinking about Blunt.
Yes.
I mean, we do. That's right. I think, it's hard to imagine I don't think we've had any spy chiefs. I mean, we had the odd ex-spy, I think, enter parliament, but it's not, not like Russia, where actually, why is Putin, um, what does he rise on? He rises partly because people see him as a Chekist. So they see him as, as emblematic of strength. So, you've had the 90s, which is a chaotic period in Russia, of kind of, economic collapse, of, crime and anarchy. And so people want a Chekist, and Putin plays up to this idea of being a Chekist in order to kind of rise through the becoming head of the FSB to prime minister and eventually president. So actually, it goes to that difference that there is in Russia, I think.
One thing I wanted to ask, but I was reluctant to, but you've mentioned Le Carre so twice, I think. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to.
Fine.
Well, do you kind of groan because Le Carre? Because reading your book, I was, of course, thinking of the Russia House. Not only the fact that the Russia House is mentioned in your book, not the novel, but also the way a sort of shadowy figure appears with important materials. A walk-in almost, and publication is involved as well. Publishing house, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually think that there is another case which is actually even closer to Russia House, and I think I don't mind. I think it is interesting to kind of reflect on the interaction between fact and fiction, because Le Carre's fiction is obviously informed by fact. He spent some time in the Secret Service in MI5 and MI6, but then also, like Russia House, is informed, I'm sure, by some real cases which he hears about on the kind of network. But then what's so interesting is that then the fiction feeds back into the fact. So, you get people in MI6 who refer to, and in the CIA, who refer to their teams as Russia House. Now, we think that is actually comes from Le Carre, that it may have predated him, but it is certainly popularized and then becomes popularized within the secret services because Le Carre's written a book about it. So, and it's one of the things you constantly see is these really interesting feedback loops between fact and fiction in the spy world, that are constantly there. So I don't think it's a mistake to actually talk about Le Carre and Bond, because I think they feed into the real life, even if they're not always a totally accurate reflection of it.
Yeah, it must be so confusing. Well, I mean, I find it confusing because you don't know tradecraft. I think is tradecraft come from Le Carre first.
Yeah, well, I was talking to someone the other day who claimed that someone else had first come up with that phrase, earlier. So there's maybe a bit of debate about it. But you're right. There's a lot of language, and even kind of mole hunts and that world. That's kind of Le Carre terminology. So he really does shape. He certainly shapes the way the public see the Secret Service and the British Secret Service, but he also shapes the way they see themselves to some extent. Sometimes defining themselves against it, as well as imitating it.
I wanted to ask about the subtitle of your book, which is "The Man Who Tried to Kill the KGB," and I suppose in a sense he kind of did because it got renamed into the FSB. But was that his ultimate goal? He wanted to sort of smash the sort of spy state forever.
Yeah, and the use of the word "kill" is deliberate there because he actually did come to see it as a beast, and I think he was, he had a slightly, eccentric, I think you could say, sense of things, and Mitrokhin, partly because he lived this very interior life. He did not talk about, he spent years with the files, he spent years copying them, and he didn't really talk to anyone, including his family. So he developed, I think, some, eccentric, was one way of putting it, maybe that's a bit harsh, but ideas, including seeing his enemy as a beast. So he saw it as a three-headed hydra or dragon. And so he saw the KGB as part of that beast, and he saw himself as almost like a kind of folk hero who was going to kill it. That was his mission, was to try and, kind of slay it forever. And I think in his mind, by taking out its secrets, the truth would be a weapon. And the secrets, the files he extracted from the KGB archives were a weapon which could be used to kind of kill this beast. And that's why when he gets out, or when he's meeting MI6 actually in 1992 in the Baltics, he actually says to them, I want two things. I want you to get me and my family out, and I want you to publish my archive. Now, this is really interesting because most spies do not say, here, I'm giving you some secret files about, Russia's biological weapons program. By the way, can you publish them? They know that's not the game. But Mitrokhin wants it published. And I think that is indicative of what he was after. He saw his files as a weapon in the form of truth about what the KGB had done, and he believed that by publishing them, that weapon would strike at the heart of his enemy, the KGB, and kill it. And that was really his aim, was to use, the truth to kill the beast, as it were.
With a spy agency not really in the habit of publishing these materials, was this a condition that they had no choice but to accept?
Yeah, in effect, I mean, that was he was. I think some of those meetings. There were multiple meetings in the Baltics through 1992. He was quite difficult to handle, and he made clear that these were the two absolute conditions of him handing over the material, were that he wanted it to be published and he wanted his family out, and so. Yeah, I mean, I think MI6 were left with a decision, and I think once they'd realised how valuable that material was, they realised they were going to have to go. That was the deal. And that they would publish it. But that in itself would be, it's the kind of end part of the book. The third part is the quite difficult journey towards publishing it, and how they do that. And it's not by far from straightforward or far from easy, because you're right, MI6 is not a publishing house and is not used to editing and writing books itself.
I just wanted to go back to, I think, a period in his operational career that doesn't go brilliantly for him. I mean, in the backdrop of the tragic circumstances of Hungary in 1956. And there's this kind of contradiction, because on the one hand, at least this is what I sense, is that on the one hand, he is very much unhappy with the KGB, I guess, later. But in 56, this is, he is, there's a water polo match that you describe very well, but that has comedic elements to it. But, you wouldn't know that he's sort of sympathetic to anything happening in Hungary. And maybe he wasn't at that stage.
Oh, and I think that's what's interesting, is that I think one of the tricky things for him is that he had been a true believer. He had been, it's not as if, he, in his early years, he is there at the heart of the KGB. He's also doing stuff in Ukraine at the end of the war, which, he never really wants to talk about, but it was a dark time. He was working as a kind of prosecutor at the time. Basically, people were being swept up and killed at the end of the war. Then he joins the KGB, and he looks like a loyal soldier. So I think you're right to say that, even if he, and then he's escorting the Soviet team to the Olympics in 56, and where's this famous match in Australia with the Hungarians against the Soviet Union. It gets out of hand and it all goes wild, and it looks like Mitrokhin, may have taken some of the blame for that, because it's right after that he's sent to the archives. And so I think you're right. It's not a simple story of someone who is always ideological, but someone who is changed by what he sees in the following years, and he comes to be changed as, I think, he and many other people became disillusioned with the Soviet Union from that time. Because, of course, this is, kind of late Stalinism, Khrushchev, and then there were hopes that maybe the country might open up, might reform. So I think he's on the reformist end, but then he realizes that's not going to happen. And then he gets deeper into the files and into the kind of sense of anger, which takes him over, I think, through the late 60s and then into the 70s and onwards.
And another fascinating part of his career was his involvement in Israel and, the new country. But this is this period when Mitrokhin is meant to be running agents, and that doesn't go very well either.
And that's another very murky period of his career, which was very hard to research, actually. There was a few people who helped me, but it was still pretty hard to kind of get accurately the full picture of what happened.
Is that because, sorry to interrupt, is that because of, Shin Bet or the Mossad are reluctant to?
No, I think I think it's more so, a kind of academic in Israel actually did look into this, and looked for traces of him and could find almost nothing. And people who knew him in Britain, and even people who knew him fairly well in Britain, said he never really talked about that. So, and I think one of the, one of the challenges was these bits of his career, which are obviously interesting, where stuff has gone wrong, which leads him to the archives, are bits he never wanted to talk about and he never wanted to acknowledge. And so I was left kind of piecing together from fragments, effectively. And it was quite an interesting process, because you just pick up fragments about him. So there, for instance, there is one note in the Australian Security Service archives of him having arrived on a boat for the Olympics in '56, where they've just got a tiny little bit of his previous history, some of his previous postings, not Israel though, but some of the other ones. And they actually don't identify him at that point as a spy, but you just get a glimpse through something like that of where he traveled to in previous years. So it was a question of just finding these tiny traces, because obviously, unfortunately, his KGB personnel file was not open to me, nor was he around to ask. So I'm very aware, actually, as a writer, that there are gaps in the story, and there are points where there's an element of supposition or based on fragments, but that is just the reality, particularly when you're dealing with spy stories, that you just have to live with, even if it's sometimes frustrating, because you'd like to be able to go, tell us exactly what you were doing in Israel and exactly what went wrong, but it's not there.
I wanted to ask you about, because we're coming to the end, but I wanted to ask about the sort of life once he was in England, and I assume he was in England. He could have been in Scotland or wherever. But was the life he led afterwards, as we know from Skripal and others, Litvinenko, that Putin is not a forgiving man?
No.
What was his life like?
Well, hard to sum up in one word. I think I would say, on the one hand, he was worried about his security, and there were points where he was worried about what could happen to him. He was both, he was still driven by the same desire to write, to record, to catalogue, to archive the truth. So this was not a man who comes out and thinks, oh, I've done my work, I'm just going to go and sit, in a nice garden in Hampshire or wherever, and, tend to my roses. He was someone who was absolutely driven to see his work published, because he had this desire to kind of kill the KGB, and because he could see it was still there. And so so that actually leads to quite a bit of tension with MI6, leads to tension about the publication of the book, because it takes 7 years for a book to come out. The book, the famous Mitrokhin archive with Christopher Andrew, that relationship is not easy with MI6 or Christopher Andrew publishing the book. It proves a very, very difficult process, because Mitrokhin is still driven. He also has a view, which is that his whole archive should be published as it is, raw almost, so that people can see it. And others are kind of like, this needs to be edited. It needs to be kind of, turned into a story, something approachable for people. And so there's tension over that. And so I think after that, he is, so I wouldn't describe him as someone who is at peace. Because he had this drive. He was most peaceful, I think, when he was with his files, working on them, cataloguing, doing in London what he'd done in his dacha in Russia, and even in the KGB archives. That was where he found his peace. But still, that drive remains. And he is, one of the fascinating things is, if you look at his last writings in the early 2000s, he is watching Russia, and he is worried by what he sees. He can see that, that the beast he'd fought is returning in some way, in a different shape, but is still there. And so he is, I think, disturbed by that, and still trying to do something about it. And that was the drive which took him through his life, and is still there in his afterlife as he comes back to, or he starts to live in Britain.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's different to someone like Gordievsky, I suspect.
Yeah, I think Gordievsky was more. I think Gordievsky had done his work, and he was still, I knew Gordievsky a bit, and visited him many times, and he would still kind of talk to people about the KGB, but I don't think, he'd done his work and got out, whereas I think Mitrokhin felt his work was still kind of unfinished in a way.
So despite Mitrokhin wanting to be an operative or in the operations, he was a born archivist then?
A born archivist. It's true. I mean, I think, he studied at the Historical Archives Institute in Moscow, and I think he loved files. So I think in some ways he was very well suited to it, even if he wanted to be a kind of frontline spy actually, files and archives were his world and would be through almost all of his life.
Gordon, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. Links are in the show notes. And of course, the rest is classified. Listeners should head to that as well.
Right. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you. It's really, really good to be on the show. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget, tickets for Chalk are still available and links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.